Well,
Hi, Andy.
this is nerve-wracking enough, and to have our former illustrious leader here at the same time makes it doubly anxious for me. But I'm going to go ahead and begin. I've got about 5 minutes of kind of preliminary things to say to sort of set the stage and get us all on the same page. So one of the great questions of religion and philosophy and the social sciences and medicine has been throughout history, why is there so much suffering in the world? And I would add to that most of that suffering is emotional suffering. And our topic today is really nothing less than that question. And we've got 60 minutes, so I'm sure we'll get it all wrapped up and answered by the time we're done. But to translate that question into the language of evolution, the question is, why did natural selection leave our minds with emotions that make us vulnerable to mental disorders and mental distress? And that's really the question of evolutionary psychiatry and evolutionary clinical psychology. What I thought I would do would be to just summarize 4 key takeaways from the lectures and readings by Randolph Nesse, who is the sort of the father of evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychiatry. And then I have a question and we'll start the discussion. So these are 4 key takeaways for me in reading that material. And I'm also about 2/3 of the way through his book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings. So the first one is that symptoms are not diseases. He hammers that home in many places. So in the same way that a cough or a fever is a symptom, not a disease, negative emotions like anxiety or low mood are not mental disorders. In fact, negative emotions have evolutionary origins, and they're useful in the situations they were designed for. Second key takeaway is that mental disorders themselves are not adaptations. So there's no net fitness benefits that you get by being schizophrenic or bipolar or clinically depressed. Rather, to use Nesse's short definition of mental disorders, he says they are, quote, dysregulated activations of otherwise adaptive features of the human mind. So essentially, he's saying that a mental disorder is what happens when an evolved emotion or emotional system fails to perform the functions it's designed for, and that failure causes the person both distress and harm. So while our anxiety and mood regulation systems are adaptations, anxiety and depressive disorders are not adaptations. Third key takeaway is that the important question, he says, for evolutionary psychiatry is the one I posed a second ago. Why did natural selection shape emotions that make all members of our species, vulnerable to mental disorders? And he stresses that is not the same as explaining the function of the emotion. It's explaining why the emotion is vulnerable to dysfunction, why it can be deficient or excessive or triggered in situations it was not designed for. And he describes a variety of reasons for that, including the most important one being that natural selection maximizes reproduction, not health or happiness. He talks about false emotional alarms, where they have low cost but protect against huge possible losses. He talks about environmental mismatch, and also talks about design trade-offs. Evolution is subject to design trade-offs and what are called path dependence constraints, meaning that natural selection can't redesign an emotional system from scratch. And lastly, a key takeaway is that despite the fact that our current psychiatric diagnosis totally ignores it, situational context is essential to discriminate between normality and pathology. So emotions evolved to help us in certain situations. So if an emotion is activated when that situation is not present, or it's either excessive or deficient in intensity or duration in that situation, that's when you can talk about disorder. So those are the key takeaways that I had from the lectures and the readings. And I thought I would toss it open by asking, what did you think of this approach to talking about mental disorders? Did it change in any way how you think about emotional distress and mental illness? Comments, thoughts? Yeah, Hank, go ahead, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. My first reaction to I was disappointed I didn't read enough of it today, and I want to plow through the book again because it addresses things that at least some of us who do different types of psychotherapy have been struggling with to counter Freudian drive theory. And first of all, the first thing is no situational thing exists for Freud in the drive theory. So that's a long time ago. But now we know culture, you know, in the biology and culture, the gene and the meme. So this is not unfamiliar thinking, but I'm not versed in the evolutionary aspect. So I'm excited that I am excited about that we're doing it. And I've got to, I think I want to get some study groups going in my field to address this. So that's my excitement about it. Yeah.
Good. Andy.
This is interesting stuff, Steve. I must confess that I did not do background reading, but I'm wondering if you could say more about dysregulation. You mentioned dysregulated emotions and moods. And does that play a sizable role in Ness's account? And yeah, could you say more?
Yeah, and I believe he pronounces his name Nessie. I always remember by thinking of the Loch Ness Monster. It's called Nessie. So that's how I remember how to pronounce his name. And, you know, it's interesting, folks, he was actually participated in one of these examined lives maybe a year ago. He signed on for one, and I was partly thought, oh my Lord, what will I do if he's on today? The father of this, of whole field. I think, Andy, that dysregulation is really key, because what he's talking about is that negative emotions in themselves are functional and have adaptations. That's why they exist. But when they become dysregulated in some way, either excessive or deficient, or appear in situations where they're not appropriate for, that's when we can begin to talk about mental distress and mental disorder. So I think dysregulation of normal adaptations is really the central etiological concept. I think Diane was next, and then Kathleen.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something along the same line. I think the distinction between emotion as a symptom and as a disorder is really the heart of what we need to look at. Because, but then the way you just formulated it almost seems circular. How do you know that it's inappropriate, except that, you know, or that it's excessive, etc. What are the criteria for?
I guess
it's dysregulated instead of you know, functional.
The degree of distress and harm that's caused. It is in a sense a judgment call to some degree, but I think it would be there's some line where experiencing a negative emotion, even though it may be functional, is unpleasant, in the same way that experiencing a cough or a fever, even though it's functional, is unpleasant. But you know, when does a fever become life-threatening, or when does low mood become life-threatening? Then you've crossed the Rubicon, and you're talking about serious dysfunction that's causing not just distress but harm, I think. Kathleen, and then Rob.
I mean, for me, this raises huge questions about so-called treatment. And just because, we know something about the evolution, what does that say about treatment and how to address it? What is the role of stories we tell ourselves as opposed to a chemical that we might start ingesting? That's a huge question for me ever since I was diagnosed in the mid-90s. And I had never felt debilitated before I had started my job. So, I mean, I'd always known I had depression, anxiety, but what is the role of context, and how much is a new culture that you don't feel you belong in, those kinds of things. And I'm just saying, this is what's the connection possibly between the two things, because treatment is not quite the same, right, as knowing.
Yeah. Nessie addresses that, and he's quite clear that this doesn't actually, at the moment at least, have a lot of implications for changing treatment, other than it can be helpful to a patient to understand that the distress that they're having is a malfunctioning of a normal system. That can sort of de-stigmatize to some degree what somebody might be going through. But I do think that a slightly different example. So I'm a retired psychologist, and I worked in university mental health. So I spent a lot of time listening to young adults talk about romantic failure, and which can be pretty serious consequences. I mean, people kill themselves over that. And so I listened also to a lot of people talk about their complaints about their boyfriends and girlfriends. Having some understanding of evolutionary psychology and what it has to say about gender differences didn't really change what I was doing as a therapist, but helping them understand those differences, that your partner may not be a jerk as much as he's just not the same gender you are. that sometimes was helpful for people to understand. I think Rob and then Hank.
It's reminding me of Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. That we have I think you mentioned it, mismatch between our cultural context and our genetic inheritance in terms of these emotions. So it's not surprising. I'm interested in what causes the dysfunction, though. Is it that, or are there other factors involved? Because the mental disorders don't seem to be particularly survival enhancing activities for an individual or a species to entertain.
Yeah, and in anticipation of that question, I actually copied a page from his book where he lists very quickly the 6 evolutionary reasons why bodies and minds are vulnerable to disease. And I'll just read them very fast, but he's got, much more detail in his book than this. 1 is mismatch, as you said. The second is infection, or really coevolution. Viruses can evolve faster than we do. Third is constraints. There are some things natural selection just can't do. Then there are trade-offs. All of the designed features of our bodies and minds have advantages and disadvantages. Main one, I think important one, is reproduction, meaning natural selection maximizes reproduction, not health or happiness. Nessie says at one point in his book, evolution doesn't care one fig whether you're happy or not. And then the last is what he calls defensive responses, that responses such as pain and anxiety are useful in the face of threats. He uses the analogy of a smoke detector, so therefore it makes sense for your anxiety to go off and have false negatives. We can also come back. He has some his chapter on depression was probably one of the most interesting things I've read on depression in the last 20 years. And I can share a little bit what he said about that if people are interested, but Hank's had his hand up, so I want to go to Hank.
Yeah. Thanks for your great summary and the knowledge you're presenting. But I was thinking about the neurobiology and evolutionary psychology of the early brain in the early hunter-gatherer. And I use this in my work a lot because it has something to do with the normalized failure to launch. In other words, does the family prepare us to live in the world outside the family when we're little kids, babies, little kids, toddlers, all the way through? And then in the psychoanalytic lingo, they call that separation individuation. So the early mind, the way it was raised in a small tribe, when there are no real luxuries, maybe you got some fire or something, it's really dangerous to leave the tribe. So if our early mind was established to go, can't go out there because there are predators, it's dark, there are animals, there are people who want to rape you or beat you up or kill you. So I actually use this in my work where the younger people struggling to have a mind of their own. I won't get into it too much. I was going to give you an example, but I remind people that your mind early on, it was required to stay in the tribe or else you're screwed, you're dead, you're main.
Mhm.
So when you're anyway, some young, like a guy I work with who just had a baby, and the families on both sides are presenting some ancient ways of, like, they bring a lot of food every day, lasagna, cake. The guy's getting too heavy, too much liquor, but the early tribe eat, kind of a thing. And he says, I'm getting fat, I'm drinking too much, I'm becoming alcoholic. But he's afraid to stand up to the tribe and say, Mom or mother-in-law, don't bring all that cake every day.
It's interesting. I have two thoughts when you say that, Hank. One is, of course, that I'm going to make a distinction between launching and individuation. So individuation is a psychological phenomenon that happened even in hunter-gatherer tribes, even though they never left. I think what's interesting is that the way we conceptualize a young adult being launched and leaving is really new in human history. I mean, for most of human history, you hung around with your mother and father and sisters and grandparents. They were all in the group. And now, post-industrial revolution, you leave and sometimes you go live thousands of miles away. That didn't happen for most of human history. And we may not be well adapted for launching in that modern use of the term.
Well, I'll give you an example. My father was a shoemaker. He was a craftsman, and he wanted to expand the business and make a Bloomfarb & Son or something like that. And I learned to do it, but I had a smart mind. I wanted to go to school and graduate school, and they didn't know, because they're immigrants. They didn't know what the hell I was doing. Like my mother said, people talk, as a therapist. I mean, she didn't say people talk to you. They go, people talk. They confide. What do you, so I was not launched. I was launched, but to a world, their evolution was, stick close to home and work in the business, make a few bucks, or, whatever you do.
If you had chosen a different path, some of us might be wearing Bloomfarb shoes right now.
That's right.
You never know.
Zappos.
Diane, go ahead.
Sometimes I think we know more than we actually know about the early family and the early tribe and so forth, because when you look at, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that when you look at the anthropological research that's been carried out over the last century or so with hunting and gathering and semi-foraging tribes, they have a lot of different ways of being, and some of them are very close-knit and some are pretty loose, and some of them have bands that easily separate into smaller groups, and others really stick together and have hostile relations with all of their neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's not like one standard foraging lifestyle. And so, but there's a good argument that the civilization we have now has anybody read Joe Henrich's work at all?
The
He's
secret
written a
of our
book.
success.
Well, that's an earlier one, and now
Okay.
the weirdest people in the world,
Huh.
which
I
is
just
basically
read that. Yeah.
which is basically about us.
We're not
you
the
know.
we're not the norm, and yet
We
we
are.
think of ourselves as that.
And I had a colleague who used to talk about the majority world versus, individualists, basically, Western individualists. And so this idea of launching as a completely independent agent in the wider world is kind of unique, I think.
And it's
So-
even worse than that. A lot of our psychological knowledge is based on college freshmen in America, basically. That's
Absolutely.
that's what the
And so-
research subjects are.
just the last 20 years or so, people have started saying, oh, maybe we should look at some, international comparisons and so forth, but there's not nearly enough of it yet.
I will say one of the things that I think that evolutionary psychology does well, David Buss being a very good example of this, is cross-cultural research to
Yes.
support, that. But Buss often will talk about a finding and then say, and I've done this study in 12 other countries and we get the same results. So I think EvPsych does
Right.
better with that than some other subspecialties of psychology. Yeah. Hank? Andy, did you have your hand up there?
Yeah, but I just threw it up though. I think Hank's been waiting. so-
Okay, go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, just in terms of with new movements about the decolonization going on the last I don't know how long, but it's been big the last 10 years, but now in the last 5 years. So I've been looking at some older materials. So there was a psychiatrist, Martinique Frenchman, Frantz Fanon, I guess everybody's heard of him. And he talks about, to oversimplify it, you can't use first world white people psychology to understand everybody else. Just it's a kind of white people centric psychology. And there's not enough research on it. So his name is being brought up again, and more people who are taking a look at in the context of decolonization. So just to raise that, so that's why this material is very important, because it's not being done enough. Like you said, Steve, all the freshmen in the United States are the guinea pigs here. Well, it's not useful. Yeah.
One of the things Nessie mentions just in passing is that we really don't know much about the rates of mental illness in hunter-gatherer societies. And he suggests that research needs to be done because those societies are rapidly disappearing. But there's challenges to those researchers because of the cultural differences. But we don't know, for example, how much depression there was in the ancestral environment or how much anxiety. Andy?
Yeah, so I'm still trying to get my head around this idea of emotional dysregulation. It's fascinating to me. So Aristotle once wrote that anyone can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person and to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power. That is not easy. So in that idea of feeling the emotion to the right degree, in other words, not too much emotion and not too little, I hear the concept of regulation there. So a regulator in I don't know, in engineering is like a little device that turns off a machine if it starts going too fast, and maybe speeds up a machine if it's going too slow. And of course, Aristotle's concept of virtue healthy mindedness is all about balance, right? Not too much, not too little. He used the term golden mean, right? Just between extremes.
Yep.
If you combine this with the evolutionary insight that emotions are our natural selection's way of getting us to behave in certain ways. So anger might get us to behave angrily, which might put an end to a treatment, mistreatment, say. That would be an adaptive application of the emotion. But when the emotion gets triggered to a disproportionate degree or in the wrong contexts, that starts to verge on a disorder. I'm trying to build up my mental model here and gain more clarity.
I think you've said it really well, and go back to your comment about regulator. Nessie talks about in the chapter on depression, he talks about what he calls our mood stat, the analogy being to a thermostat. We have a mood stat, and that can become dysregulated in a variety of different ways. So I think you're right on target, Andy.
This is helping me.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Sage.
Yeah. So I just wanted to open up a general question that relates to just what we can learn from an evolutionary perspective on our minds. I think the big one that is easy to hang our hat on is what we've been talking about, our social environment. Steve Cohen, a psychologist, has a great point around social baseline theory, which is that for all of human existence, the one constant has been other people. And so understanding our psychology in the social sense is enormously important. But I guess I'm wondering, that one has, that's easy, right? And because of that kind of axiomatic premise, but it's really hard to, for me to feel confident about other insights relating to, this point around symptoms not being equal to dysfunction. The reverse is also hard to show, like that symptoms could equal some sort of function, because all of our samples are from highly confounded modern environments, confounded by evolutionary mismatch. As we said, we don't know how depressed people were in the Pleistocene. So
he doesn't say, Andy, Sage, he doesn't say symptoms are not dysfunctions. He says they're not diseases.
Okay, yeah, that might be a better way of putting it. But just to the point of, I'm just kind of asking for those who are closer to the material, what are some equivalent to social baseline theory, kind of like major insights that we should really feel confident about relating to our evolved psychology that would improve our modern understanding despite the challenges of studying it? Are there big ones that come to mind, Steve, for you, for instance?
Well, I'm going to let Hank answer first since he threw his hand up. He's thinking faster than I am. You're muted, Hank. Yep, you're still muted.
Still muted, yeah.
Buddy, come on.
There you go. There you go.
Oh, hi. I'm not responding directly to your very fine-tuned question, but I was going to go back to leave out social baseline theory and the thinking about neurobiology of the brain. So the first comment I want to make is, and I think you said it was somebody who said it, but the mind body rather than there is just the brain, the Descartes split, the mind and the body. No, at least the current thinking, I don't know whose brains they're using, but there is no split, and that the mind and the body operate together, and whether the context and the social background influence the brain. But some neurobiologists have outlined the notion of how the mind body works, and one is, the brain, the non-conscious brain, not the unconscious, like Freud collects data. This is Lisa Feldman Barrett is the one that I studied the most recently. So the brain, I think most of us know this, the brain collects data, it organizes data, and then the data gets organized based upon prediction. Based on this data, this is the outcome. But according to these thinkers, the brain has an error correction device. And is the brain at that level, is that prediction correct or not? And that's where mismatch comes in. It's like, well, it's correct in one situation, but it's not correct in another situation. So I was listening to a comic. He's an Italian American guy. He makes a lot of fun of his own group, but he talks about if he made a mistake when he was a kid, his father would beat the shit out of him. All right. In his context, now he's got kids now. He doesn't beat the hell out of kids, but he wants to. So he's able to have that error correction. He's able to go, hey, that's not right. You know, like I want to yell at my dog. I mean, I don't yell at the dog, but I'm used to being yelled at. Well, not that much, but so I'm saying in the neurobiology, which is not the social baseline theory, it's no pure item of pure neurobiology, because according to the other thinkers in this neurobiology, is the brain is the greatest mimicker in the universe. The brain mimics all the organs, internal organs, mimics all the neural pathways, the circulatory system, and it mimics the environment, and then that gets organized through data collection. So that's my little summary of addressing not the guinea pigs of freshman college people, but some of the newer research. But there's no way to get away from the social context.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're primates, so I don't know how we talk about anything to do with human beings without the social context. And there's certainly a lot that's been written lately about the brain being a predictive machine in some ways, and that also relates to some of these theories of depression, which I can talk about if people are interested later on. But Kathleen has her hand up.
Well, to tell you the truth, it's early in the morning here, and I wasn't able to attend closely to the earlier part of the conversation. I did read some of the preliminary materials, and I want to acknowledge Sage for putting together really beautiful little packages for us to prepare for these sessions. But I was a therapist, and I was really pleased to notice that my own perspective in my practice, I'm retired now, was that I had a very evolutionary perspective, and I did normalize emotions and then talk about that, what Nessie calls a smoke alarm. I would work with people to illustrate how you need anger because it mobilizes energy to protect oneself or one's family in the face of threat or even death. But it's not appropriate when you're driving down the freeway and a little old lady's in front of you and she's driving real slow and you're weaving in and out of traffic and endangering people's lives. I'm also was very steeped in interpersonal neurobiology. In my practice, I've kind of moved into other directions, but it defines mind as the exchange of energy and information between two brains. And there is no mind without another person. And I don't think it's sufficient to say that we're social. The interpersonal neurobiology clearly correlates development of specific brain subparts of the brain to relationships, the quality of relationships, and the ability of someone to both trust, have secure attachment, which is related to anxiety level in a social situation. It has both biological, but also very strong social correlates. Abused kids are more anxious with other people. They don't trust them, right? And that's also related to addiction, because there's a correlation between addiction and trauma and dysregulated emotions, excessive levels of anxiety, which is tamped down by, it seems in the moment, by drinking alcohol in the presence of others. So this is a really fascinating discussion, but there's just so much more to unpack. But I really appreciated the presentation of the book, and that psychiatry was really bringing that contextual piece in, because that's been missing all along. And that is what we have to start doing, is identifying those situations that are driving a lot of these mental illnesses. I don't know how stable the rate of mental illness has been across time, but I do believe that capitalism, just to be political and lefty progressive, with especially in America, the uncertainty people feel about living, paying for housing, having food, that creates abnormal levels of anxiety, depression, and anger that's related to a lot of our social problems around the expression of violence, mass shootings, etc. So you can't uncouple
Okay.
that.
Thanks, Kathleen. I don't know if Kathleen Hart or Andy had their hand up next.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Do you know who was up
I
first?
defer to Andy. I always like to hear what he says.
Okay.
Well, what I wanted to say is actually going to connect what the two Kathleens have been saying, or I think. So first of all, I just wanted to thank Kathleen W. here for her example of regulated and dysregulated anger. That helps me with my connected through my Aristotle quote, which is great. But to pick up also on something Kathleen H. said earlier about depression and its ability to kind of nudge somebody out of an unhappy work situation, Kathleen, I think you might have mentioned.
Well, I
And
was
I know-
mentioning I didn't have it until work, but that, you know.
Well, my own struggles with depression, and this was decades ago, had to do, came about under a really unhappy job situation, work situation, where I was, being abused emotionally, and the depression, when I finally came to terms with it, led me to leave that dysfunctional job situation and a much happier context for me. So this reminds me of something that was in the blurb for today's session, which is, I guess there's a hypothesis that depression, are depression symptoms, are they functioning to solve an adaptive problem of some kind? I mean, is
They
depression a signal that, you need to change your life situation?
I'll come back to that after Kathleen says her piece. They're one of the books on depression from this perspective is called Subordination and Defeat, Andy. So it's an interesting fit with your description of your job situation. But let Kathleen go.
Okay, if we're thinking in terms of group selection and not just individual selection, that's where I start wondering, well, what if it's really healthy for people to have a scapegoat? And what if there are people who just end up being, low on the hierarchy and they fulfill a function for the group enough to reproduce, but they're miserable. And the first book I read by Nessie, he quoted someone named, I think, Hartung, and it really, I don't know if I'm saying that right, who said, that if you are, in a situation where you're constantly lower, and if you let's say you have ideas, you have suggestions and so forth, but you're in a situation where you're considered, uppity for doing that. He says something like that can, cause depression. And then I think of women. I mean, there's an extent to which it would be maladaptive, possibly even in the ancestral environment. I don't know, for women to be too self-assertive. I'm just guessing. I guess my point is, just because you're miserable doesn't mean evolution's purposes aren't served. And I guess I was thinking, well, what is the effect of group selection on this? Like David Sloan Wilson, talks about how you can't have a group where all the chickens are at the top of the pecking order. And so misery
Nessie,
might be bred into the situation.
Nessie is not a fan of group selection. I'll say that. And the subordination and defeat hypothesis of depression is not Nessie's, it's someone else's, but it would certainly explain why there are sex differences in the ratio of depression. Women are more often in positions of subordination and defeat in our society. Nessie's theory in a nutshell is that low mood, now this is not talking of, again, major depressive disorder is not functional, it's not an adaptation. It's a dysregulation of low mood. Why do we have low mood? Nessie talks about that primarily in terms of goal-directed behavior. And he says what low mood does is prompt us to give up unattainable goals and consider alternatives. So I have one short quote about it from him. I wrote down, he says, mood reallocates investments of time, effort, resources, and risk-taking to maximize fitness in situations of varying propitiousness, so that we have the ability to sort of, we have a goal, we have something we want to attain, and at a certain point, we have an ability to sense how likely it is to attain that. An inability to give up an unattainable goal will cause depression. He also talks about that as an explanation of why many people that are very wealthy and very successful nevertheless struggle with depression. And it may be because their goals, even though what they've attained for most of us mortals is quite impressive, it's not enough for them. It's not what their goals are. So holding on to an unattainable goal, whether it's pursuing a mate that you can't have, or fame or wealth or academic fame or wealth, I don't know, that's when low mood can spiral into major depressive disorder. So his chapter on depression is worth the price of his book alone, in my opinion, because it's a really new way of thinking about depression, at least it was for me, in terms of goal-directed behavior. Hank.
Yeah, there's another way that I've been looking at, didn't think of it in this way, as a pursuit of an unattainable goal. I work with a fellow who, let's say his basic kind of belief system is, I don't want to do anything. Well, so this guy, if you think of him, he's diagnosed with major depression, PTSD, and addiction. All right. So the way I've been thinking about his dysfunction, along with others, is that he's looking to find the lost mother of infancy. Is a guy's book from a guy named Hedges way back. Remember, this is all psychological, nothing biological.
Aren't we all, Hank? Woody Allen once said he wants to go back to the womb. Anybody's.
Yeah, but I'm not working that hard at it. And everybody here, this guy is really dysfunctional. And the basic, so the whole notion of infants and their profound dependency for the survival. So I see this in people, and this is one guy I've been working with for a while now. So here's an example. He's seen a medical person for meds. Well, this medical person is top notch. I mean, is really thorough. Anyways, he's doing a lot better. She knows the medicine. He got a CPAP machine. He's doing whatever he needs to do, getting the proper medical care that he neglected. She called me yesterday, says we have to have a meeting. He fired her. Nobody has given him, he gets shitty, schlocky care from a lot of medical people. And he's got a great guy who's a wonderful, famous GP. And the guy just gives him his drugs. He gives him his Ativan, not his Ativan. What's the one for
Adderall?
Learning? Adderall. Guy's addicted to Adderall. She says, I can't give you the Adderall because you're addicted to it and it'll mess up and you'll get more diabetes. I don't remember all the medical stuff. He's determined to be that helpless baby. Now, will I get through to this guy ever? Probably not. But, you know, I'll do what I can, because that's going to take years, if anything, on the level of dealing with trauma like that. But here's an example of, again, in a clinical setting where, so how is that? So his goal is to get unconsciously is to get the lost mother of infancy at all costs. That's why I'm relating to what you're describing on the psychological level. It's dysfunctional. And so, but he needs his drugs. You know, he's not going to acknowledge it, but it's pursuing a goal that can't be achieved.
Yep.
You know, again, there's another example.
Well, that fits quite well because your job as a therapist would be to help him give up that goal, which may require insight first, that he's even doing it, because you see that goal, but he may not see that goal yet. But yeah, it fits pretty well with what Nessie would say in terms of depressed mood. He talks about addictions, by the way, primarily in terms of mismatch, and the availability of substances, psychoactive substances being so much more available in the modern environment. Of course, they existed in ancestral environments, but not to the degree that they do in our modern environment. So his chapter on addictions is pretty interesting too. Other comments, questions? Okay. Oh, Kathleen. You're muted, Kathleen.
Sorry, I was just thinking of like situations. I mean, when I read about depression a lot, like double binds where you don't realize your goal is unattainable because you're getting these mixed messages.
Hmm.
And that's really tough because
Yeah, and I suppose the way he would talk about, you know, the way being trapped in and defeated and humiliated in a horrible job is related to depression, is that in a way, if your goal is that I need to be happy, but I also need to stay in this job, that's unattainable. You have to make you have to make a choice. The only way I'm going to be happy is to not be in this job.
or to change your hopes or attitudes about the job.
Well, yeah, sure. Yeah. Although that makes me worried because it sounds like sort of accepting defeat. Maybe that sounds like maybe you'd end up with dysthymia rather than major depression. But Andy, oh no, I think Diane was first and then Andy. You're muted, Diane.
I wanted to go back to something about emotions in general. So if Andy wants to follow up on what's been talked about, I'll wait for him.
No, there's no, go ahead, Dan.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's a tendency we have as weird people, you know, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic as the acronym has it. We still think very much in individual terms. So we're talking about the goal of Hank's patient, for example. But actually, emotions, I think, if we're going to understand them correctly, are not just individual experiences. They are also a signal system. There's signal system to the individual, but also a signal system that gives other people messages about how they need to deal with us. And so in the example of anger, for example, it's something that you feel and it makes you do certain kinds of things, but it also makes you makes other people want to do certain things to reduce your anger or to eliminate your, or whatever the case may be. In other words, it's a social signal. And likewise, something like depression is not only an individual experience, but it's a signal to others.
Yeah, Diane, in the book Subordinate.
Like, leave me alone, you know, for example.
Well, don't hurt me.
Or don't hurt me.
The subordination and defeat hypothesis of depression likens it to the submissive behaviors that a beta chimp will make in the presence of an alpha chimp, and quite literally talks about how facial expression and body posture and a number of things in depression mimic what a lower status chimp will do with another chimp to stop being beat on. Literally, physically. Yeah.
I've
so
seen
it's a signal. So
really, really interesting about chimp versus humans, not versus. When they want to signal subordination, they bow down.
Yeah.
What do people do? They bow down.
and people that are depressed, people that are depressed don't walk around all erect.
That's right. So you can read it from the posture and that kind of thing. And so the main point of what I'm trying to say is that emotions are just as social as they are individual. Yeah. And sometimes our emotions are a kind of reading of what other people are thinking or saying or doing to us. So if you are being treated as a subordinate, for example, perhaps you get depressed. And
Mhm.
there's good reason to think that.
Mhm.
Humans form hierarchies beginning at the age of, I don't know, 3 or 4 or something like that, when you put them in groups, same age
Mhm.
groups. The kids who go to the bottom of the hierarchies start having physical symptoms. They get colds, they get fevers, they have anxiety, they have depression. So yes, it's all mind body.
I have to quickly react to one thing in the chat. Rob put, double bind, referring to Gregory Batesman, come here, go away, which is a description of both borderline personality disorder, but also normal adolescence.
Mhm.
The best book I ever read on teenagers, and this was the title, it was written by a psychologist. It was called, this is the literal title of the book, Get Out of My Life, but First Will You Drive Me to the Mall?
Mhm.
Okay. Andy and then Hank.
Yeah, I think we've been talking about depression as a form of emotional dysregulation, and you can see why that fits. But I just stumbled upon an article from Scientific American in 2009 arguing that not only can depression be understood as highly adaptive for certain purposes, but that it actually, here's a quote from it. Let's see, so apparently if you put somebody into a situation where they need to spend a lot of time analyzing stuff, their brain will start to make all kinds of interesting emotional regulation changes in the body to help them analyze better.
Right.
So analysis requires a lot of uninterrupted thought, and depression coordinates many changes in the body to help people analyze their problems without getting distracted. It goes on to say that, they're asocial, their antisocial attitudes, and many other features of depression actually seem to be nice, finely tuned
Mm-hmm.
to aid a highly analytical problem-solving process.
And Nessie would agree with that, but he wants to make sure you're using the word depression with a little d to mean low mood, not depression with a big D to mean major depressive disorder. Is that the function of low mood is to do exactly what you're saying, Andy, according to Nessie, which would be to sort of take stock of the situation and the goals that I'm striving for, and think about whether I should make different, reallocate my resources. That's so again, low mood is the adaptation and has function, but not when it arises to the level of disorder. That's what Nessie would say. Hank and then Kathleen.
Yeah, I wanted to take us back to the evolutionary aspect, and it's like about, I think is the definition of evolutionary fitness, you're fit to reproduce?
Survive and reproduce, yeah.
That's it. So can we think of the way we're talking about mental, whatever we're calling mental disorders, or beyond beyond like the low mood or the, even a little euphoria is good, low mood, euphoria, as long as it doesn't become manic depression. And you choke your wife while you're having sex, that's another problem because you can't reproduce if you kill her, But it's just the way I've seen it, But how is this? Can anybody put in the context of how is that somewhere secretly part of fitness? The extremes, the way the way Andy put it, the whole notion of the golden mean rather than the extreme.
Nessie would say that most traits are on a bell curve, although some of them are higher slopes, but it's the extremes are you either have an excess of the emotion or a deficiency of the emotion, and that's where disorder lies. And Nessie is one of the first people that I've read that also talks about deficient emotions. We need to think of those as disorders, not just excessive. The only time that's ever really come up before was when people talk about psychopaths being deficient in empathy. But you can take almost any emotion and be deficient in it, and then it
Yeah.
becomes this, highly dysfunctional.
Well, just to add to that, Steve, there was a term that a guy named the psychiatrist Henry Crystal coined way back, and he called it alexithymia. I don't know if, but that is just the deficiency of emotion. And he coined it because he was, I guess, a German Jew who was in the Holocaust, and he worked with a lot of Holocaust survivors early on and doing the psychiatric evaluations and the theorizing. So this concept of alexithymia was adaptive. It's what's the term, that when there's too much trauma, when people are getting killed and dying and you're in danger, you got to shut down. So you're lucky you could live and then be fit and reproduce, which was happened to a lot of victims of the Holocaust. They reproduced like bunnies right away.
So psychic numbing when you're under psychic numbing when you're under trauma is functional, but psychic numbing when you're not in those type of situations is dysfunctional. So emotion always has to be understood in terms of its situational context. Kathleen, I think you had your hand up.
I think we're out of time.
We are.
Since I've been hearing that, I had so many other thoughts that I don't know. I can't choose right now. I have a problem. Can't choose. So.
Well, my hope for today was that it would just get people interested enough that you might decide to pick up Nessie's book, which is again called Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, written for the general public, filled with interesting case histories because he's both a practicing clinician as well as a researcher and theorist. It's a very entertaining read. So.
And now we know how to say his name. I didn't know it was Nessie.
Well, in one of the videos that I suggested that I gave to Sage to list, he's introduced, and the folks introduced him as Nessie. So hopefully he didn't correct them. So hopefully I'm saying it correctly. Hank, you had one final thought.
Just a comment, and my chat's not working again. I don't know why, but this is to Andy. Andy, in terms of self-regulation, I imagine you've researched the guys like, I forget his, but the whole area of trauma and self-regulation is like thousands of articles and books. So I don't know if you've looked into that realm, because I know you wrote the book on the mental, the immune system, mental immunities. Just to remind, I couldn't write it in, so I wanted to mention it to you.
Thank you. I'll take a look.
Yeah, okay.
All right, guys. Well, let's just give a big thank you and round of virtual applause to Steve.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much for taking us into this. I think it's great to rotate a little bit because we have different subjects that are close to our heart, and we could really feel the attention and care you put into this, Steve. So again, really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And per our votes, the next session, to my recollection, is another that Steve suggested, which is monogamy. So Steve, you're welcome to take the reins again. You don't have to decide now, but
I need to explain that that's not close to my heart. But I mean, monogamy is close to my heart. The question about whether should be monogamous is not.
Yeah, what do you know about monogamy, Steve?
Yeah, what do I don't know. I'll ask my wife of almost 50 years. Okay.
All right.
I could do that since I suggested it. I'm not as knowledgeable about that literature as I am about this stuff, but I suggested it because there's controversy about whether or not our species is monogamy and sort of natural for Homo sapiens or not. And I don't think it's a settled question.
Well, that we'd be happy to have you, and
Okay.
And that's great. All right, we'll do it on January 19th. And until then, we can keep it going on high-low, but otherwise everyone have a fantastic holiday.
Yep.
And we'll see
Happy
you
holidays, everybody.
next year. All right.
All right,
Nice to
take
see you all
care.
again.
Bye-bye.